We see you, our neighbors, our friends, our acquaintances, standing outside, looking in, wondering about church and faith. You may never ask us a single question, but we know you're wondering the same things we do. Is there any meaning to this life? Where do we go when we die? Is God calling me? This Sunday, we invite you to rediscover church, that we're not so different, you and me. Church is not just for insiders. Ask Jesus. He's been waiting for you.
There are so many good reasons to believe in God. You may consider the fact that the most famous, important question is, why is there something rather than nothing? You could look at the moral argument, the fact that we believe there are things that are right and wrong, and that those truths transcend time and place. You could talk about the life of Christ himself and ask if there is a more enviable way to live. There are lots of good reasons to believe in God, but that raises the next obvious question: which God is it that we should believe in? And that brings us to the claims of Jesus Christ. Who is Jesus? Remember last week we went through the life of Christ, and we talked about how the kinds of things he told his followers to value became staples of Western civilization. Care for the young, care for the old, equality of men and women, Jew and Gentile, black and white. We saw him teach us to care for hurting people in the first hospitals that were developed for all in need, and sustained throughout history come from religious Christian people. But my question for you is, who is Jesus really? Everybody has an idea in their head of who Jesus is, and we think we know. A few years ago, a Christian writer looked at all those movies. There's movie after movie after movie about who Jesus is. Now, this is before The Chosen came out and answered all of our questions. But before that, there was all these movies about Jesus, and so this one guy watched all of those major movies about Jesus and then read the Gospels. And the contrast in his mind was so different, he wrote a book entitled it, The Jesus I Never Knew. But we think we know. We have images in our heads, and of course, you trace it through history. Us in the West, we were so fond of Jesus that all of our artwork ended up looking like a Western or Scandinavian Jesus. A few years ago, a forensic anthropologist who for a living does art sketches was asked by the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. They said, look, the evidence we have of Jesus is he's something like a 33-year-old carpenter or whatever, and lives in Palestine his whole life, and there was nothing in the Old Testament that says there was nothing about his looks that would make us desire him, and so what would an average person look like? Just draw that up for us. This is before AI became a big thing, and in 2001, he came out with a picture. You ready for it? All right, here it is. Yeah. Now, I don't know about you, but when I saw that, I thought, that's what I thought the Apostle Peter looked like. Would you die for this man? We have images in our heads of who Jesus is supposed to be, and discovering the real Jesus can be quite alarming. Even among scholarship, Jesus was constantly presented in the light of our own reflection. If you were a 13th century aristocrat, always hanging out in king's courts, you ended up thinking of Jesus and writing about Jesus as if he was a king like the kings you know. If you were somebody who was an oppressed minority, who was living at a time in which the ruling class was really pushing down on you, you ended up seeing Jesus as an upstart religious zealot. If you were living in the 60s, and you thought of Jesus, you thought that he should be this countercultural revolutionary, you would describe Jesus, and by the time you're done, he looked very much like a hippie. And that's why Albert Schweitzer, the very famous doctor turned New Testament historian, wrote a book about all of these lives of Jesus histories and said every one of them ends up looking like someone staring down into a deep well and seeing their own reflection. And Jesus ends up confirming everything I want to believe and telling me to do everything I want to do and looking very much like however I want to look. And the real Jesus gets lost. There was a debate a few years ago between a Christian and another person who struggles with what we would call traditional Christianity. And in that debate, the title was, "Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up?" I like that title. That's what I want to do this morning. I want to present to you this morning, will the real Jesus please stand up? And the first thing that we need to establish is that Jesus of Nazareth actually existed. I know that seems like a low bar, but that's the first thing we need to get out there, because about every 5 years, right around either Christmas or Easter, somebody who wants to be known in scholarship but isn't known yet will publish a book saying something like, "There was never anyone named Jesus." And they'll get their name in major magazines for about a week, and then they'll be forgotten after they sell some books. But we just need to put this to bed if there's any question about this. I want you to know that whether or not Jesus existed is not a serious question in scholarship. Tacitus was a Roman historian. He lived in the middle of the first century, not a Christian. Has no reason to make any of this stuff up. He's writing Roman history. And in Tacitus's annals, he tells us that there was a group called Christians. And the Emperor Nero was really putting the pressure on this group and says this group arises from someone he calls Christus. And he says this Christus suffered the extreme penalty, which we all know to be crucifixion, under the reign of Pontius Pilate. The Jewish historian Josephus, not a Christian, was born in 37 AD, and he spent his whole life in that region. He lived through the fall of Jerusalem, which begins in 66 and ends in 70 AD, and he describes the fall. He writes all about it. And in his writings, he tells us about James, who he calls the brother of Jesus, and he has a long quote, a very famous long quote, about Jesus himself. Now, it's famous and it's infamous. Here's some things you need to know. We're looking for truth here, so we don't sugarcoat. Over the centuries, most of the people who were interested in preserving history were Christians. So this quote about Jesus has been handed down through copies by Christians. So if there's anything about Jesus in these quotes, it raises the suspicion that later Christians wrote this and pretended like it's what Josephus actually wrote. That's a real question in scholarship. But I want to tell you two things to think about. Number one, the standard textbook that you go to in any major university on Josephus's writings about Jesus, written by two very critical scholars, come to the conclusion that the parts of the quote that we know for certain come from Josephus confirm that he says there was a man named Jesus who lived in the first century, who did strange deeds and was known for those deeds and taught many wonderful things and had followers who believed in him, called Christians, and he was put to death for his beliefs at the hands of Pontius Pilate. That's the first thing. Here's the second thing. Just a month ago, a new book has come out on that quote. And the author is making headlines because he makes the case that every word of that original quote is accurate. I have not read the book yet. But if it is true, can I share with you some of the lines that over the years we've thought were added by later Christians that this man says is original? How about this one? There was about this time a wise man, if indeed it be lawful to call him a man, because he was the Christ, and he appeared alive on the third day. Early critics of Christianity, people like Lucian and Celsus, write about why they don't like Christianity, why they think it's wrong. Not one of them ever said, and of course we know Jesus never existed. That argument didn't come up. That's not a reasonable, rational claim that Jesus never existed. There is more evidence for Jesus' existence in history than there is for a whole host of historical figures that you studied in school that your teachers declared to be factual historical characters, which is why some of the most critical New Testament scholars, like Bart Ehrman or the whole Jesus Seminar, who really doubt so many things that we want to say about Jesus, say, without question, Jesus of Nazareth lived in the first century. He had followers. He was known for his deeds. He suffered death on a cross at the hands of Pontius Pilate, and a group of believers known as Christians rose because of him. And that's just the external evidence. What about the internal evidence? We've got these ancient documents, let's not forget about those, from the first century that tell us all about Jesus, known as the New Testament. And of course, critics say, well, you can't trust those. Those are prejudiced. Well, wait a second. Plato tells us about Socrates. Aristotle tells us about Plato. They were all students of the one before them, prejudiced all. But if you remove what they tell us about the other, we would know almost nothing about these famous historical philosophers and all the history about them. And yet, you can go get degrees, master's degrees, in any one of them. Livy wrote a book called Roman History in the first century. We've lost the original. We don't have it anymore. What we have are copies. We have 20 copies of Livy's book on Roman history. But the earliest copy of his book that we have is 900 years removed from the original. We still use it. We still teach from it because that's the norm for all ancient books, except the New Testament. With the New Testament, we have full manuscripts, whole manuscripts of the entire New Testament, dating to within 300 years of the close of the New Testament. We have fragments, pieces of some of the books of the New Testament that date to within 50 years of when it was written. And how many Greek manuscripts do we have to work with? Remember I said 20? Do we have 8 surviving copies, like Herodotus or Thucydides? Do we have 10 surviving works like Caesar's Gallic Wars? Do we have 20 like Livy? No. We have 5,800 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament and 10,000 in Latin. The New Testament is the best attested work of the ancient world. And when scholars debate differences among the manuscripts, they'll tell you our problem is not that we have too little, our problem is that we have so much. And the New Testament tells us an enormous amount about Jesus of Nazareth and who he actually was. For example, Jesus was a real human person. Now, scholars, critical scholars know that and take that for granted. Sometimes as church people need to be reminded of this. Maybe you've never been to church, but you just heard the name Jesus and you thought, wasn't he some apparition of light that showed up in the first century? Beamed down from heaven? The Gospel of Luke goes out of its way to say, no. I want to tell you about this person, born of a woman named Mary. This person who grew up and experienced life like you experience life. He had a human body. He had a body that went through stages. Think about this. Next time you just want to choke your teenager. Jesus was a teenager. Jesus got tired. Like when the Bible says that Jesus sat by a well because he was weary from his travels. He fasted for 40 days, and then the most underwhelming statement ever. And after it, he was hungry. Yeah, I bet he was. Jesus had human emotions. He could be moved to righteous anger when he saw sin and abuse. He could be moved to pity and sadness with the loss of a close friend and saw people he loved crying over his death. He could be moved to love. There's a great story where Jesus is talking to someone who's very rich. He's got a lot of things the world has to offer, but he wants to know, what command do I need to follow so I can have eternal life? And Jesus sees a man who's got everything the world offers and says, but I still want to know if that's right. Now, it doesn't always end well for him, but in this moment, the text says Jesus looks at him and loved him. He had several disciples who followed him around, and there's one who wrote a book in the New Testament about him, and he calls himself the disciple whom Jesus especially loved. Jesus had human experiences. Besides birth and death, he faced temptation. He grew up as a boy and an adolescent and a teenager. He learned things. He had to grow in wisdom as well as in height. I don't think Jesus at 1.5 made the perfect chair. You thought about this? I think he learned how to make chairs. He was either a carpenter, as we historically think, or a stonemason, which is what we now think the word actually means, but he worked with his hands. Don't you think he learned how to do things? Being morally perfect does not mean that baby Jesus is sitting in the manger looking up at the stars and going, I remember making those. That's not the way we should think of Jesus. Jesus is a real baby who grows and learns. One later New Testament writer said it's very important that Jesus was a real human being, because when we go to him in prayer and we ask him to intercede for us, we're not talking about someone who doesn't know what it's like. We're talking about someone who knows what it's like to be us because he is one of us. And Jesus taught such wonderful things and did such wonderful works. It's safe to say that Jesus was a great moral teacher and example. Read the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most challenging sermons ever recorded, that has challenged nations by its power. Think about his ethical life and the difference that he made in his morals. Western civilization owes its list of virtues to the life of Jesus Christ, and others have noticed this. Mahatma Gandhi, maybe you've heard the name, very famous religious leader, not a Christian, one time was reflecting on Jesus. And he said, I believe that Jesus was one of the great teachers of mankind. But he said more than that. Consider his life. Gandhi says, a man who was completely innocent offered himself as a sacrifice for the good of others, including his enemies, and became the ransom of the world. It was the perfect act. We know that Jesus existed. We know that he was a human being like us. And we know that he was one of the world's best teachers and examples. Perhaps that's enough for you to find him interesting. Maybe you're curious enough to say, I want to know more about that person. I might even be willing to follow that person, as many, many people follow lesser known and less reputable teachers in their lives. But Jesus claimed to be even more than this. And we need to take his claims seriously. For example, Jesus made some unusual claims about himself. Just think about one of these for a moment. You know that we all need bread to survive. And in the first century, Jewish people would gather at a feast. It was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And there they would remind themselves of something only God can give, remembering a story in the Old Testament when God provided manna from above. And it was in the context of that kind of feast that Jesus opens his mouth and he says these words, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. And whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. That's quite a bold claim. At a festival of lights, another festival, the Jewish people would gather together to remind themselves of only God who made the great lights in the sky. Jesus opens his mouth and he says, I am the light of the world. At a time when the Jewish leaders would say, take the Old Testament law as your yoke, the big wooden beam that would go on top of oxen to make them row together. Take my law upon you as your yoke and learn from it, and you'll get Sabbath rest. That's in the Mishnah, the collection of sayings of the Jewish leaders in the 200 years around Jesus. But Jesus says, take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. The language was simply too close to what God says about himself in the Old Testament, that when people heard him say things like that, they wanted to pick up stones to stone him for blasphemy. But that's not all. He made what you might call indirect claims about himself. In the first century, if you wanted to be healed, you could go find a healer. There were some around. There were some who legitimately could heal. We know that because Jesus is approached by his disciples and they're saying, there's somebody over here casting out demons. What do we do with them? And Jesus says, leave him alone. He's doing a good thing. There were people who could heal and cast out demons. And there were some probably who couldn't but pretended like they could. There are all kinds then. But if you needed a healing, you go find a healer. But if you needed to be forgiven, there's one option. You go to the temple. Sacrifices made for you. So on one occasion, Jesus, because he has the power of God, is healing, and he heals someone. And just to add insult to injury, he looks at the crowd and he says, what do you think's harder? Do you think it's harder to heal someone or to pronounce them forgiven? And there's a great trick being played here. Because obviously, to say the words you are forgiven is a whole lot easier than to actually heal someone. But there were several healers, but only God can forgive. And so Jesus heals the man and says, you are forgiven. No temple, no sacrifice, just the words of someone who dared to think that they could offer forgiveness. And the text says the people began to wonder, who can forgive sins but God alone? Who indeed? It's a great question. To put a finer point on it, there are a few places where Jesus makes much more of a direct claim. He calls himself the Messiah. He calls himself the Lord. He calls himself the Son of God, and his followers would bow down to worship him. And it is a sin to receive worship as if you're God, and Jesus received worship. When angels came and talked, and the apostles saw the angels and bowed down, the angels said, get up, I'm not God. And Jesus never does that. He receives worship. He calls himself phrases that in the Old Testament only applied to the Father. And Jesus makes these claims. I want to consider two passages in John's gospel for just a second. On one occasion, Jesus said, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. And on another occasion, Jesus says, I and my Father are one. Now, this is more than what a great moral teacher and moral exemplar would say. And it's actually problematic as a moral example if, in fact, his claims are untrue. You see, we really have ultimately four options, one of which has already been removed. You see, it could be that Jesus is simply a legend. But we've already shown you that we have good reason to believe Jesus actually existed, that he did strange deeds, that he had followers who believed in him. The legend part just kind of goes away. So that gives us three more. L's are easy way to remember this, that he is either a liar, he didn't say it, he didn't mean it, he didn't believe it, he knew what he was doing was wrong, he's a liar, or he's off his rocker. The word we often use for that is lunatic. Or he's actually what he claimed to be, that is, that he is the Lord. And I didn't get these original with me. This comes from a man named C.S. Lewis a few years ago, the Cambridge philosopher, well-known Christian scholar, who put it this way. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being only a great human teacher. He's not left that open to us, and he did not intend to. But I'm not just asking a historical question. Who was Jesus is something I can answer. But who is Jesus to you is something only you can answer. Most of us in this room this morning have come to know Jesus Christ. We don't just think that he lived, we think that he is living. And we know that because he has made a difference in our lives. When we take of the bread and the wine and we reflect, we don't just remember what was done for us. We remember what he's doing for us, interceding for us. Because we believe that Jesus, the same one whose feet walked the sandy shores, the same one whose feet were nailed to the cross, walked out of that tomb 3 days later and rose to sit at the right hand of the Father and is now interceding for us in the control room as we wait his imminent return. The question is, who is Jesus to you? Is he a great moral teacher who did some wonderful things? Is he someone who laid down nice virtues for us to follow? Is he someone who challenges you to be a better husband and wife, father and mother? Those are all good things. But he claimed to be more. And he wants more of you, if you'll let him. Thank you for joining us. I hope you've been encouraged. I hope you've been enriched. And if you have any questions, any thoughts, any comments, reach out to us at prayers@wschurch.net. God bless you. Tune in next week.